Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to paint the picture of business in Africa. I am Fifi Peters. On the agenda, we ask our panel of experts, how does Africa treat its entrepreneurs and how should they? In Youth Africa, we speak with an entrepreneur who quit her job from the frustrations of being an undervalued employee to establish a successful construction company with an environmental-friendly twist. First, we speak with Anayi Zote for business news making headlines around Africa. So, what is attracting your attention today, Anayi?
Thank you, Fifi. The Nigerian President, Muhammadu Buhari, submitted to Parliament a $750 million supplementary budget for 2018. The approval of the national budget has already been delayed by 6 months. Buhari said implementing the nearly $30 billion national budget for the year will be extremely challenging. The supplementary budget includes funding for the 2019 elections. A $1.5 billion contract for the construction of a port near Angolan capital, Luanda, has been revoked. The company reportedly had close ties with Isabel dos Santos and the daughter of former President José Eduardo dos Santos, who ruled the oil-rich nation for 38 years before stepping down last year. Since assuming power, President João Lourenço has sought to ease the grip of the predecessor's family on the nation's economy. Ethiopian Airlines Enterprise, Africa's biggest airline, is reportedly in discussions to back the Nigerian government's plans for a new national carrier. Talks about new venture are reportedly taking place at the Farnborough Air Show in England. The new airline is expected to begin operations this year, although a name for the carrier has not yet been announced.
Since João Lourenço assumed the Angolan presidency last year, he appears to have systematically targeted the Dos Santos family business empire. This has really taken a lot of people by surprise, as it was thought that Eduardo dos Santos had handpicked his successor to prevent his family fortune from being targeted.
That's right, Fifi. Angolans had become increasingly angry at President dos Santos' rule, with allegations of large-scale corruption in the oil-rich country. Isabel dos Santos became Africa's richest woman, and many people believe that this was achieved through graft. President João Lourenço has to be seen to be taking action in both the interests of his presidency and that of the ruling MPLA government. This is not the first time Lourenço has targeted the dos Santos family business interest. Soon after coming to power, Isabel dos Santos was dismissed as the chairwoman of the state oil producer Sonangol. Her brother, José Filomeno, was fired as head of Angola's $5 billion sovereign wealth fund.
Thank you, Anayi. Now, earlier, Anayi spoke with a couple of young authors, or to be more specific, the great-grandchildren of Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, born 100 years ago today in the South African Eastern Cape village of Mvezo. Madiba, as he is known, needs very little introduction as one of history's most renowned men. Let's take a listen.
My name is Ziwe and Lene Mandela, and I am 6 years old.
Wow, and how does it feel to be an author at such a young age?
It feels great, and it also feels so nice. It's fun doing all different sorts of stuff that I never knew about.
Hi, my name is Zazie Mandela and I'm 8 years old.
Great. Zazie, tell us, why did you decide to write a book to your granddad?
We wrote the book because we were asking lots of questions and we were curious about Granddad Mandela's life and how he grew up and what he had to do in prison and how many years he actually grew up in prison, then more years he grew up on land instead of in prison.
Okay, and what's the one question that you would ask him if he was here today?
I would ask him, how do you feel being 100 years old today? And I would ask him, do you know how to use all the gadgets we're using today, Granddad? And I would also say, I love you and happy 100th birthday.
My name is Lindo Mandela. I am mother to two young, brave authors, Zazi and Zweli Mandela.
How do you feel to be the mother of two young authors?
To be a mother of two young authors is an incredible privilege for me. I think it's a beautiful thing to be able to, and a great responsibility equally, to be able to frame a young mind in a way that is hopefully positive and that can have an impact on the world for many generations to come. I think when words live in a book like this, particularly for the generation that is between the demographic of 4 to, let's say, to 12, you're in a special place to frame the narrative of their lives going forward, and I think that that's a very special position to be in. And I think that to answer questions truthfully also helps keep me in check with what I consider the reality or the truth, and it keeps me honest to that particular truth, especially around their identity, around their very, very young lives, and I think around human rights issues and the young people and the young demographic. And I think this is obviously not a conversation we're all used to in South Africa quite specifically, but I think that the rest of the world will begin to see, and I hope this to be true, we'll begin to see a much more concerted effort in teaching young children about human rights, because these are global citizens. I mean, the world for them is getting much, much smaller, and how they need to be able to invoke those rights anywhere they land up in the world in their future. And I think such books teach them that, and this kind of curiosity allows them to tap into that freely, and for them to sort of show up to the rest of the world as free, beautiful human beings, proud of their own black skins. And I think that there is particularly a wave around the world where we're starting to see more and more of this, but not necessarily with very young children. So I think that the impact will be that much greater if we concentrate a little bit on them.
Time for our regular Wednesday slot, Youth Africa, where we put a laser focus on young entrepreneurs who are shaping theirs and the continent's economic future. Vera Shaba founded Green Building Solutions after realizing that working for someone else placed unacceptable limits on her talents. Vera, you resigned from your job out of frustration of constantly being put in a box. Why was it so easy for you to turn to entrepreneurship?
I think that it was so easy for me to turn to entrepreneurship because there was no other choice. I really loved what I was doing in my jobs, but then there was that frustration of either being a mechanical engineer or a green building consultant. So I really wanted to continue to make the difference that I was doing in the green economy. And that's why entrepreneurship was easy, because I had no other choice if I wanted to outwork the vision that I wanted.
And your industry is very male dominated. How are you able to make a name for yourself as a young woman in this industry?
That's a very good question. I would say that the best way to make a name for oneself is through credibility. That's it. And the best way to get credibility is by being excellent at what you do. It makes no difference if you're a woman or man, young or old, black or white. As long as you're excellent at what you do, that makes a name for itself.
Vera, a lot of young people sit idle at home waiting for an opportunity to work or to start a business. How can they break free from that kind of frustration? What advice do you have for them?
So the best way that I can influence, having been in the Forbes under 30, is really to continue to advocate for the green economy. So the United Nations has said that hundreds and thousands of jobs can be created simply from the green economy. If you look at solar energy waste, from July, Johannesburg, for instance, is making it mandatory that we need to have recycling points in buildings. And so there is a lot that the young can do in terms of the green economy. And being in Forbes has really helped me to reach them and also to show them that there is a lot more within the green economy in Africa.
After the break, our panel of experts talk entrepreneurs in Africa. Welcome back. This is Capital Connection. It is common wisdom that the drivers of employment are entrepreneurs. Think of Nigeria's Aliko Dangote, Zimbabwe's Strive Masiyiwa, or Tanzania's Mohamed Dewji. That they have created 1 million or more jobs between them would, you think, make them a valuable and respected asset. To discuss how Africa treats its entrepreneurs and how they should, we are joined by the CEO of Elevate, Trinity Ncube, in Johannesburg, and in Kigali by Davis Kayonga, the founder of PesaChoice, and in Lagos, Kendall Anayi, the CEO of Tizeti. Kendall, could I begin with you? I mean, given the important role that entrepreneurs play, you would assume that government would make it smooth sailing for them to do exactly that. Do business on the continent, create jobs. Would you say that this is the case?
It depends. So it depends on what country you're talking about. So for us, we have a lot of success in Nigeria setting up our unlimited internet plan. So we applied to the regulator, got our licenses, went into a spectrum auction, got into the spectrum. But taking that business model and trying to replicate it across West Africa, then the regulations change. Even though telecoms internationally is the same set of regulations. So for example, in Ghana, there's minimum local ownership that is required. So in setting up a subsidiary there, we had to look for local partners. That slowed down the process before even applying for the license. And right now we're still waiting for the license. So it's been a few months. And obviously each country is going to be different regulations we're going to map. The business model is the same. The need for unlimited internet is there, but you now have to meander through all the different regulatory requirements as you move across Africa. And I'm even just talking about English-speaking African countries. Then you now have to deal with language barrier, dealing with regulators in a different country, and that adds its own complexity.
Right. So red tape and language barriers are certainly not conducive, but that governments are asking you to find a local partner is certainly a positive for the entrepreneurs in that country, which leads me to you, Davis. I mean, Kendall has just told us that the government of Nigeria fairly supportive of its entrepreneurs. What are things like in Rwanda or East Africa broadly?
So, Rwanda in particular, we have managed to get a lot of support from government. Of recent, there's been a big campaign around made in Rwanda products. Actually, when you go into the manufacturing, the textile industry, they banned the second-hand clothes so that they can support the textile industry within Rwanda. Now, us in the tech space, there's still a bit of a challenge because when other big players come in, they have better, more trusted technologies. But the government has put a big campaign around what they call Made in Rwanda. I recently joined what they call the private sector here in Rwanda, and one of our biggest things that we had to deal with was keep visiting all these Rwandans who are trying to do something. Now, private sector has some support, government support, but it's entirely private. And the goal of it is to try and promote and find these young entrepreneurs who are doing things and see how can they advocate for them to the government so that they can have a much bigger impact in the communities. So far the government seems to is doing actually great in Rwanda with the Made in Rwanda campaign that started sometime in the last year.
Yes, and your government has even gone as far as to ban clothing imports to try and encourage and grow the local textile industry. Trinity, I mean, we've heard from West Africa in terms of Nigeria and Rwanda saying quite a lot of support that government is giving to respective entrepreneurs in those regions. Yet why do we have so many entrepreneurs, particularly here in the South, crying that they're not getting enough support?
Well, my view over what we have observed over the past 3 to 5 years is that government wants to support. However, there's a lot of red tape. The entrepreneurial ecosystem has been politicized quite a lot. So we at Elevate, what we are doing is helping small to medium businesses grow. To be able to do that, we believe that should be done in an African ecosystem. So one of the key challenges that we find, particularly if you want to partner with your brothers from Kenya, Angola, Nigeria, if you go to Zimbabwe or whatnot, what you find is there's a lot of red tape, as one of the speakers was talking about. We haven't really tapped into the ecosystem. And one of the key issues is access to markets. When you want to grow, you don't want to just grow in South Africa, but you want to grow regionally as well as globally. The opportunities are there, but it's such a pain to be able to get into those markets, because then we have a lot of bureaucracy, we have a lot of legal wrangling and whatnot. So I find that there needs to be a concerted effort on all sides. African governments coming together and say, look, how do we get the best out of Africa? Because I mean, we really have a vibrant youth who are entrepreneurial, and one of the key issues is when we talk to entrepreneurs every single day is that our professional people in corporate are not really entrepreneurial. There's this feeling that entrepreneurship is for an entrepreneur, somebody who's doing business outside a corporate setting. But what we find is a lot of global companies are trying to attract people who are entrepreneurial within the company. So this is something that really has to trickle down in the entire culture of the society to say, how do we make everybody entrepreneur? Because at the same time, what we notice as well is that within corporate culture, we have people who are just coasting through their jobs. They just like to be paid the big bucks and they're not productive. And for myself, having worked so hard to get where we are now,
sure,
we don't want that from our youth.
Sure, but I actually want to focus on the corporate side of it, because I mean, yes, we've got the public sector that needs to enable an environment for business to do business, but we've also got the private sector that plays an equally important role in creating opportunities. Kendall, I want to throw it back to you. Private sector support for entrepreneurs, and here I'm speaking specifically about access to finance that is a bugbear for many businesses starting out. Do you think that the private sector is conducive enough in this area?
So for me, starting off my business, I started it by bootstrapping. Well, it was easy to bootstrap my business because it was a subscription business. So as long as you acquire customers, additional customers each month, and you hold them for a period, your revenue grows over time. But obviously you want to move as fast as you can, so capital helps that, and telecoms is actually capital intensive. So looking for funding, so we started off trying to look for funding locally. So you reach out, normally friends and family. Once you've tapped that out, you want some kind of external investor. But the investors we saw locally, the venture capital investors operating locally at that time, were giving really bad terms. So we didn't get the support that we needed at the time. But we kept on going, so we actually did get a term sheet back then, and then rejected it, and then just decided that maybe we can put in a little bit more effort, and we just kept growing the business. But by the time we needed to actually access funding, we actually had to go all the way to Silicon Valley to get funding. And that fundraise was, by all intents and purposes, was easy. It was done in 3 weeks, and we were able to raise the capital that we needed for the next round. Then fast forward a year later, we're now raising our next round of financing. Same approach. I try to start locally within the ecosystem, locally in Nigeria, and even within Africa. So we talk to investors in Kenya, some in South Africa. We got this whole long process that the diligence process that they go through that really ends up with what I'll call time wasting, when either they're not going to make an investment or they need some kind of signal to make the investment. But sure, if I compare it with my capital raise outside of Nigeria, it was more straightforward, more defined. If you're not going to make an investment, they're going to tell you as quickly as possible so that they don't, because they know you're running a business. But I now had to go across 3 continents for my next fundraise: Silicon Valley, on the East Coast, New York, Europe, and even all the way to China.
And
to round that up because this was a much larger raise.
Yeah,
but,
and Kendall, that is certainly a problem. I mean, if you allow me to jump in there, because the ease of capital from another continent, sure, that's great, but it obviously comes at a higher price tag than you would have to pay if you were getting the money locally. And Davis, I want to find out your experience on this, the private sector's role in supporting entrepreneurship by way of access to finance, but also by way of allowing small businesses to be partners or suppliers to big business.
Access to finance is a big problem, unfortunately, when it comes to the African market. Rwanda has a fund that is supposed to be starting, which has 100 million, but that fund only caters to some of the tech companies. And previously, most access to finance that was received, it goes to specific industries. I believe actually it's the same on most of Africa. The access that some entrepreneurs need to flourish is a bit too high, and the valuations are not really understood by the private sector. Now, government itself and other sponsors who are coming in are sponsoring specific market segments, such as a space like healthcare or agriculture. I know in those areas, the entrepreneurs that are in those spaces have access to grants. Rwanda has another, it's a bank called BDF that's supposed to help startups with access to finance. Now, they don't really give you capital. What they do give you is if you have a scale-up project, they can help you with get a loan from a bank, so they become more of your guarantor, because since most startups don't even have equity or enough assets that they can use to get a loan in the bank. So that one we do have it. However, coming back to what my colleague just said, is if you're a tech company and you need access to a finance in order to scale or break out into the market, and what the funds you're asking for is much higher, let's take an example of $1 million or more, and you're in the tech space, you are forced to go outside to find that funding, because the funding that is provided, at least I can use one as an example, those specific industries that I said have access, but still also limited. You're looking at a couple $100,000 or less.
Sure.
So when we as who are in the tech space, you start creating a product, and if you're going to scale, in order to get the actual funding and people who understand the type of business you're into, you are forced to go to Silicon Valley or Europe, somewhere where they understand the technologies, that space, and you do your pitch.
Sure.
But if you're entrepreneurs in the agriculture space and you're looking for 50,000, some of that, most of it, at least in Rwanda, you're able to get it through grant. We even have another group called Access to Finance Rwanda, which
right, so it's quite
have a lot of money also to give, but most of it goes to that.
As you are explaining there for us in the case of Rwanda specifically there, Davis. Trinity, let's just wrap up now, because we've heard from our colleagues across the continent that private sector could do more. Governments could do more.
Yes.
But then we also need to look at the role of the entrepreneur herself or himself in getting this support. There was a survey that was released the other day about entrepreneurs in Africa that around 60% of them don't even know their credit score. And this is a very important thing to know if you're looking for finance from the formal banking system. So my question for you, and I'm hoping we can conclude on the role of the entrepreneur themselves in making themselves ready to receive more support either from the private or the public sector.
Great, that's a great question. So when we look at the entrepreneur themselves, which is what we do every day, we have identified the lack of financial education. And I'm not talking about the formal financial education. There's so many ways in which the entrepreneur, him or herself, can actually educate themselves. There's quite a lot of material online. So looking at that, what we find is that the entrepreneurs themselves are unable to distinguish between venture capital and angel investors. So that's a big challenge. We went through that process ourselves when we were starting out. And as a result, for instance, my colleague was talking about the tech industry and the specificity in terms of where do you actually go and find the money. So if you're in the tech space, it's very probable that you could speak to a venture capitalist, and then you do really need that amount of money, you know, to go in the tech space. Then you also get other service-based subscription online businesses that don't necessarily need venture capital. All they need is a great idea that can scale. They can have an angel investor. So that sort of knowledge is missing at a lot of. So every entrepreneur we see, the research what we do, we find out that they don't know the differences. And as a result, they go seek funding in the wrong places. So if you look at the IDC, the DTI, if you go to the banks, they are most likely to be unsuccessful when they go and source funding there. And there's a lot of disappointment. If you speak to the entrepreneurs every single day, it's about the funding. But where do you get the funding? Where do you get the information? So we're encouraging our local entrepreneurs to be able to go out there and seek. I mean, this is the role of government as well, to provide this, you know, the information. So when I look at the government, I mean, we have 1.5 billion rand that's been earmarked for funding entrepreneurs. Where does this money actually go? Nobody knows how to source, how to apply for these things. So there's a lot of roles for mentorship and coaching in terms of the financial space. And we find that missing. But then again, we don't want the situation where our entrepreneurs are just taking a reactive role. You know, we want them to, we want them to go out and really be proactive. Yes. Because there's also this feeling that for me, actually, I don't like, because when I go and speak to entrepreneurs, it's like they're sitting back and expecting somebody to come and hand them. It doesn't work like that.
No, it certainly does not. I mean, time waits for no man. But gentlemen, thanks so much for your time. That is where we'll leave it. On the Monday edition at 6:30 p.m. Central African Time, we will be discussing the blue economy and if and how it will benefit African economies.